Canada plans to slap warning labels on unhealthy food. I'm Marco Perry. Welcome to the Perry Platform. Reuters is reporting that Canada is going to slap warning labels on sugary, salty, and fatty foods. So, foods high in these three things will come with clear warning labels starting in 2026. And this is coming straight from the federal government. When asked for the rationale behind this move, the government said that it's an effort to promote healthier eating choices and to reduce chronic health risks. But when you dig a little bit deeper, that's just the wrapping. Really, what they're trying to reduce is healthcare costs. Those have become astronomical, and there is a major backlog that existed before COVID, and COVID just made it worse. The vast majority of human history was characterized by malnutrition. Now we're on the opposite side of the equation, especially in Canada. Malnutrition is still a problem, but things like obesity are becoming more so. America is perhaps the epitome of that. Now, this next statistic, if you never heard it before, is quite alarming. The CDC reports that U.S. obesity prevalence was at 42% between 2017 and 2020. That's getting pretty close to 50%. Pretty close to every other person being considered obese. People here in Canada are looking at that and they're saying, we definitely don't want to go down that same path. So what can we do? Perhaps these labels are one thing. Now, on our side of the border, Health Canada also had a couple things to put out, and I think this was the impetus that really got the government moving. So, diet-related chronic illnesses like diabetes and heart disease are leading causes of mortality and morbidity in Canada, with the economic burden, and here's the important part for the politicians, estimated to be $28.2 billion per year. That's a lot of money. Getting these diet-related chronic illnesses under control would be a massive cost savings, and one that I hope would be used to reinvest in our healthcare system to help us better prepare for other types of ailments that are plaguing Canadians. There's one other trick that I would like to propose that the government look into. Oftentimes, it's just confusing to figure out what is healthy and what isn't. And one reason for that is because our nutritional facts labeling is completely incomparable in some cases. One organization will put their cereal and list the stats for a 50-gram serving. Another will do 100 grams. And if one company realizes that the sugar intake at that level is a bit too high, it's turning people away, they might cut their suggested serving size down by 25% to reduce the sugar number there. And then now, if you're a consumer and you're comparing these labels, you might not have the time to do that mental math to figure out the fair comparison point. This should be standardized, at least for similar products. If we're doing pasta sauce, make it 100 grams as the serving size for all of them. If it's cereal, do 100 as well. To have these shared basis points will make it far easier for people to make educated decisions about what they're consuming. The corporate foolery I see here is just appalling. I've noticed it in particular too with soft drinks. Before, they would say the entire can is your serving size, and the sugar would be something like 40 grams. But now I've seen companies say that half the can is each suggested serving size, and the nutritional facts label will represent that. I was looking at that one day and I realized that it wasn't the sugar was actually going down, it actually went up, but they're just trying to play with the fractions here. There are also other conflicts that will eventually bubble to the surface when it comes to the government and food. There are intense lobbies in things like dairy and meat, and they did appear to have some hand in this regulation. It is stated that the policy will not apply to certain foods, such as plain milk and whole eggs, due to their health value. It will also exclude raw fish and meat, whether whole cut or ground. Now, on one hand, you can kind of see why that makes sense. These foods have been historically staples, and the data just shows that they're relatively good for you. They're foods that are not as bad as that bag of chips or that candy. Now, would it make sense to just have everything labeled accordingly? If it's high in fat, it's high in fat. And the consumer can figure out for themselves if that makes sense. To have the exceptions could give the image that the government is playing favorites. And if you don't think that the dairy industry, the meat industry, was out there next to make sure that this exception was given to them, then you just are not familiar with the terrain here. I do see the argument for having exceptions like this, though, but I just hope that the buck stops there. Imagine if the meat lobbyists extend this to things like beef jerky or processed meats now. Well, then it becomes problematic because the meats in their raw form are obviously at a base level. It's what you do to them that can make them healthier or less so. But if the lobbyists have their way, we could see things change, and that's one thing we'll have to be aware of. Yeah, now that I think about it, I wonder what something like bacon would fall under. Is that considered a raw meat? And if it is, then it wouldn't get that health warning, even though it's arguably pretty bad for you. So perhaps there is a conflict there already. Now, to go on a minor tangent, Ottawa seems to be very keen on getting people's health in order, mostly due to the expenses that we're seeing. Aside from these consumption-related illnesses, there are other illnesses that plague the system due to poor decision making. And one of these ones that we've seen historically is smoking cigarettes. So, the federal government proposed that they're going to be writing health warnings on individual cigarettes. Not just on the packaging now, but on each one. And if Canada is successful with implementing that policy, we're going to be the first country to do so. And I'm okay with that, honestly. I think there should be no people smoking cigarettes under any circumstance. But, of course, you do have that decision to make. The government is not your father or your mother. We can just educate and hope that you heed the warnings and the obvious downsides to partaking in such a behavior. Cigarette smoking is interesting because it's not just people doing it because they like it. There's social contagion too. It has that hue of being cool. Or maybe you're pressured into it because your peers at work are doing it. Smoking is interesting in that sense because it's almost like getting one extra person to quit can have a ripple effect where the effects of that action are multiplied. Getting the extra person to stop eating a Big Mac, though, might not have that same social contagion consequence. Now, where do I overall stand on these changes, whether it's the health warnings on the food or the individual cigarettes? I'm in favor of them, actually. And I do see some gray area, but to begin with the positives, many people just have to get their act together. And ultimately it is your decision, but what should the government do? I think their role is to arm you with information, make it readily accessible, make it easier for you to make informed decisions, and then if you still choose to do things that perhaps are not in your best interest, well, that's on you. We do live in a free country. I'm certainly not in favor of the prohibition approach, like where we deem alcohol to be so bad for people that we just ban it, because we know where that leads. It leads to illegal activities. It doesn't stop people from partaking, it just makes it more shady and dangerous. I can imagine junk food going down a similar path. Imagine that, the dark web of the French fries. You need a dealer to get you nuggets. And aside from the illegality of it, I just don't think it's the government's place to force you to do one course of action or not when it comes to personal choices like what you eat. Now, where I do think they have a role is, as I said, education. Making sure you understand the potential consequences of your action. All too often, we've seen the opposite. So this is a breath of fresh air. We've seen the government cover up for companies who are donating to their campaigns, hiding the truth from you, making you feel like you're doing a good thing when in reality, you're not. And cigarettes is the prime example of that, where the research wasn't forthcoming. We had cigarette companies funding the studies into whether or not they cause cancer. And it's ridiculousness like that that does make the government somewhat unreliable. So for them to finally be forthcoming and to make decisions that aren't going to appease some massive corporations, that's a step in the right direction. Now, of course, they have the other ulterior motive, which is the cost savings that can come from reducing burdens on the healthcare system. So it isn't purely altruistic. They don't truly care about your personal well-being in the ultimate sense. They just care about the externalities that come from bad decisions, the strain on our systems. Now, you will, of course, have the lobbyists complain that's unfair to their organization, and you might even have some individuals who say that the government has become a nanny state, that we don't need them to put labels on here. People can Google it. People can search it up. We don't need people to be so spoon-fed information. There are certainly realms where I would agree with that, and here some people may think that there's some inconsistency with things I've said before, but let me just clear the air there. When it comes to things like political messaging, when it comes to determining what's ethical, for example, when it comes to determining what constitutes hate speech, it has no scope for quote-unquote educating the masses. that's purely a subjective domain, and one in which they can warp to accrue power. But we're talking about the realm of science. We're talking about how much calories does that donut have? What's the concentration of saturated fats in it? These are things that the government can regulate and they can share objectively. Of course, if they start skewing the numbers to make one brand more favorable because that brand is helping them get reelected, that's a scandal, and they have to be held accountable. And we do hope that the individual public servants and scientists who are working with the FDA, for example, and the Canadian equivalent, we hope that they'll call that behavior out and expose it. But this is very different. The same thing with labeling cigarettes. Very different than political and philosophical areas of interest. There, I'd be 100% on board with keeping the government out. There's no room for a nanny state in that regard, but when it comes to things like this, there certainly is a point to make about the public interest and how the government can better serve that. Now, these changes to the food labeling are supposed to come into effect in 2026, so not that far away. It will be interesting. Interesting to see how we adapt to that and how the companies do as well. And with that, it does bring us to the end of our conversation for today. If you enjoyed the material, be sure to leave a review and share. It'll help us grow. And you can find me online at perryplatform.org and on social media at perryplatform. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you soon.